The rain came down in torrents the day my daughter threw my gift into the trash. I can still hear the harsh rustle of the plastic bag, the careless thud as it landed in the bin outside her pristine, suburban home. It wasn't just any gift. It was a quilt stitched by my hands over 6 long months, each square, a piece of our shared past, her first tricycle, the daisy crowns we wove by the river, the lullabies I sang to chase away her nightmares. I was 65 that day, and I dared to hope foolishly, perhaps, that my birthday might matter to her. My name is Eleanor, and I'm 68 now, sitting here telling you this, because I need you to feel what it's like to love someone with every fiber of your being and still be reduced to nothing in their eyes. I was born in a quiet Ohio town, the kind where neighbors knew your grandmother's recipes and your father's handshake. My father was a carpenter, his hands rough but gentle. My mother, a seamstress, taught me that love was woven into the things you crafted. I married at 20 to Thomas, a man whose summer sky eyes and warm laughter made my heart sing. We built a modest life rich in love, if not in wealth, and when Claire arrived, she became the sun around which we orbited. Thomas left us 10 years ago, his heart giving out before I could say goodbye. And after that, it was just me and Claire. Or so I believed. I gave her everything, my time, my savings, my dreams. I sold my small dress shop to fund her college, downsized to a tiny house so she could have a wedding that dazzled. I thought that's what mothers did. I thought it was enough. That birthday 3 years ago shattered my illusions. Claire had invited me to her house, a grand place with white shutters and a lawn so manicured it seemed to mock my modest life. I was nervous clutching the quilt in its careful wrapping, my fingers stiff from months of needlework. I'd pictured her face softening the way it used to when she was small, and I'd surprise her with a new skirt. Instead, she barely glanced at it. "Another blanket, Mom," she said, her tone sharp as if I'd brought her something trivial. Her husband Greg sat nearby, engrossed in his phone, while her teenage sons Michael and Ben were upstairs, their music pulsing through the walls. No one said happy birthday. No one offered me a slice of the store-bought cake on the counter, its icing already smudged. I tried to fill the silence, asking about her job, the boys' school, but Claire's eyes kept flicking to her watch. "We're pretty busy today," she said at last, standing as if ushering out an unwelcome guest. My cheeks burned, but I smiled because that's what I'd always done. I handed her the quilt, my heart hammering. "I made this for you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It's our stories." She took it, scarcely looking at the wrapping, and set it on the counter beside a stack of dirty plates. "Thanks, Mom," she said, already turning away. "I'll check it out later." I left feeling smaller than I ever had, the rain soaking my coat as I trudged to my car. But the real blow came the next day when I drove past her house on my way to the market. There in the trash bin by the curb was the quilt. The wrapping was ripped, the fabric spilling out like a gash. I stopped the car, my hands trembling, and stared. She hadn't even opened it fully. She'd thrown it away as if it were garbage. As if I were garbage. I don't know how long I sat there, the engine humming, the rain drumming on the windshield. Part of me wanted to climb out to rescue it, to cradle it like a wounded child. But something held me back. Pride, perhaps, or the weight of all the years I'd spent trying to be enough. I'd raised Claire alone after Thomas died, worked double shifts at the library, mended her heartaches, celebrated her triumphs. And yet, here I was, invisible. A mother who'd given her all reduced to a discarded gift. I drove home, my tiny apartment feeling like a tomb. The walls were lined with photos, Claire's graduation, her wedding, the boys as toddlers. I looked at them and felt a sob claw at my throat. When had this distance begun? Was it when she married Greg, who always seemed to tolerate me at best? Was it when the boys grew too old to call me Grandma Ellie? Or had it always been there, a fracture I'd refused to acknowledge? I sank onto my couch, the quilt's absence a phantom beside me, and wondered where I'd gone wrong. The weeks that followed were a fog each day, pulling me deeper into a loneliness I hadn't known was possible. I stopped calling Claire, waiting to see if she'd notice. She didn't. Months slipped by and the silence grew deafening. I'd see her posts online, beach vacations, candle-lit dinners, her perfect life, and I'd wonder why I was excluded. I'd always been the one to knit the family together to host Christmas, to remember anniversaries. But now it was as if I'd been erased. I began avoiding mirrors because the woman staring back was a stranger. My hair was more silver than brown, my hands freckled with age, my eyes heavy with grief. I was 65, but I felt ancient, as if the world had deemed me obsolete. Claire's rejection wasn't just about the quilt. It was about me, my age, my role, my worth. I'd spent my life being a mother, a wife, a nurturer, and now that those roles were gone, who was I? I kept going, though, because that's what women like me do. I went to the library, shelved books, smiled at patrons. But inside, I was unraveling. I'd lie awake at night, replaying that moment at the trash bin, wondering if I'd failed as a mother. Had I been too soft, too giving? Had I taught Claire to take me for granted? The questions gnawed at me, but no answers came. Then one gray morning, something shifted. I was walking through the park near my apartment, the air crisp with autumn. A young woman sat on a bench, sketching in a notebook. She looked up and smiled, a warm, genuine smile, not the pitying kind I'd grown used to. "Lovely day, isn't it?" she said, and I nodded, caught off guard. We talked for a few minutes about the changing leaves, the way the light danced on the pond, and for the first time in months, I felt seen. Her name was Lily, a 25-year-old artist who'd just moved to town. She didn't know my pain, didn't know the weight I carried, but her kindness was a pinprick of light in the darkness. That night, I lay in bed, Lily's smile lingering in my mind. I thought of the quilt of Claire, of the years I'd spent chasing her love, and I realized something: I couldn't keep waiting for my daughter to value me. I couldn't keep begging for a place in her world, but I also couldn't let her rejection define me. I was more than a discarded gift, more than a mother who'd been forgotten. What that meant, I didn't yet know, but I felt a spark, small but stubborn, igniting within me. I rose from bed and walked to my sewing table where a half-finished project lay. My fingers brushed the fabric, and for the first time in months, I felt the urge to create. Not for Claire, not for anyone else, but for me. I didn't know where this path would lead, but I knew I had to walk it. I was Eleanor, and I was still here, still breathing, still worth something. And that was enough to begin. The days after that moment in the park felt like waking from a long, heavy sleep. I'd been moving through life like a ghost, my heart tethered to the image of that quilt in the trash. But Lily's smile had loosened something inside me. It wasn't hope, not yet, just a faint pulse of possibility, like the first green shoot breaking through winter soil. My name is Eleanor, and I'm telling you this because I want you to know what it's like to feel discarded by the one person you thought would always see you, and how even in that ache you can find a way to stand again. My apartment, once a cozy haven, had become a shrine to my loneliness. The photos on the walls, Claire's first day of school, her prom, her wedding, stared at me like accusations. I'd stopped dusting them, letting a thin veil of neglect settle over the frames, as if I could blur the memories they held. I'd wake each morning to the same routine: coffee, library, home silence. The library was my refuge, its quiet stacks a place where I could hide from the world. I'd shelve books, my hands steady, but my mind adrift, replaying Claire's coldness, Greg's indifference, the boys' absence. My grandsons, Michael and Ben, hadn't called me Grandma Ellie in years. They were 16 and 14 now, caught up in their screens and sports, and I wondered if they even remembered the summers we'd spent baking cookies or building forts in my backyard. I stopped checking Claire's social media because each post, her laughing on a beach, her perfect family at a restaurant, felt like a fresh cut. She hadn't called since my birthday, hadn't texted, hadn't noticed my absence. I'd always been the one to reach out to plan to mend. But now I couldn't bring myself to dial her number. I wanted her to miss me, to feel the void I'd left, but the longer the silence stretched, the clearer it became. She didn't. That realization was a weight, heavy and cold, settling in my chest. I was 65, a widow, a mother, and yet I felt like I belonged to no one. The loneliness wasn't just about Claire. It was the way the world seemed to look through me now. At the grocery store, younger cashiers barely met my eyes. At the library, patrons brushed past me, their voices loud with youth. I'd catch my reflection in a window, silver hairlines etched deep around my mouth, and feel a pang of invisibility. I'd spent my life being needed, being central, and now I was peripheral, a footnote in other people's stories. I wondered if this was what aging meant, not just the ache in your joints, but the slow erasure of your place in the world. But there were moments, small and fleeting, that kept me from sinking entirely. One was Lily. A week after our park encounter, I saw her again at the library, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. She was looking for books on local history, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Eleanor Wright," she said, and I nodded, startled that she'd remembered my name. We talked for nearly an hour about the town's old mill, the way the river used to flood the stories my mother had told me about her childhood. Lily listened, really listened. Her head tilted, her smile warm. When she left, she said, "You should tell more of these stories. They're beautiful." Her words stayed with me like a melody I couldn't shake. For the first time in months, I felt like someone had seen me, not the old woman, not the mother who'd failed, but Eleanor, the person. Lily's kindness stirred something, but it was another encounter that pushed me to act. One evening, as I locked up the library, I found a letter slipped under the door. It was from Margaret, an old friend I hadn't seen in years. We'd been close in our 30s, raising our kids together, sharing coffee and secrets. But life had pulled us apart after Thomas died. The letter was simple, written in her familiar looping script. "Eleanor, I've been thinking of you. I heard about your birthday. I'm so sorry. Can we talk?" She'd included her number, and for days I stared at it, afraid to call. What would I say that my daughter had broken my heart, that I didn't know who I was anymore? Finally, I dialed. Margaret's voice was like a warm blanket, familiar and soft. We met at a cafe the next day, and I was nervous, my hands fidgeting with my scarf. She was older now, her hair white, her face creased, but her eyes were the same kind, steady. Over tea, I told her everything, the quilt, Claire's coldness, the trash bin. I expected pity, but Margaret's face hardened. "Eleanor," she said, "you don't deserve this. You've spent your life giving. It's time you took something back for you." Her words hit me like a gust of wind, sharp and bracing. Took something back. What did that even mean? That night, I sat at my sewing table, the one Thomas had built for me decades ago. It was cluttered with half-finished projects, threads tangled like my thoughts. I picked up a piece of fabric, a soft blue cotton I'd once meant for a dress for Claire. My fingers moved almost on their own, threading a needle, stitching a simple pattern. It wasn't for anyone else this time, just for me. The rhythm of the needle, the quiet pull of thread, felt like a conversation with my younger self, the girl who'd dreamed of designing clothes, who'd believed she could make something beautiful. I sewed until midnight, and when I stopped, I felt a flicker of pride. It was small, but it was mine. The next day, I took another step. I'd been avoiding the park since seeing Lily, afraid of hoping for connection, but I forced myself to go. The air was crisp, the leaves a riot of red and gold. Lily was there sketching by the pond. I hesitated, then walked over. "Mind if I sit?" I asked, and she grinned, scooting over. We talked again about art, about the town, about nothing and everything. She showed me her sketches, delicate lines of trees and water, and I told her about my sewing, about the quilt. I didn't mention Claire, but Lily seemed to sense the weight behind my words. "You should make something new," she said. "Something that's just yours." Her suggestion was simple, but it landed like a seed in fertile ground. Over the next weeks, I began to reclaim pieces of myself. I sewed more, not for gifts or obligations, but for the joy of it. I made a scarf, then a table runner, each stitch a small act of defiance against the emptiness. I called Margaret again, and we started meeting weekly, our conversations a lifeline. She told me about her own struggles, her son's distance, her husband's illness, and I realized I wasn't alone in my pain. We laughed too, remembering the silly things we'd done as young mothers, and those moments of lightness felt like stealing back joy that had been locked away. I still thought of Claire, of course. The hurt was a constant companion, a bruise that ached when I moved too quickly. But I stopped waiting for her call. I stopped hoping she'd see me. Instead, I focused on the small things, the feel of fabric under my fingers, the warmth of Margaret's voice, the way Lily's laugh made the park feel alive. I wasn't healed, not by any means, but I was moving step by tentative step towards something new. One afternoon, as I walked home from the library, I passed a community board covered in flyers. One caught my eye, a local art fair seeking vendors. My heart quickened. I'd never sold my work, never thought it was good enough. But Lily's words echoed something that's just yours. I tore off the flyer, my hands trembling with a mix of fear and excitement. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. Maybe it was time to show the world and myself that I was still here, still capable of creating something beautiful. As I stood there, the wind tugging at my coat, I felt a shift. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a quiet resolve settling into my bones. I was Eleanor, and I'd spent too long letting others define my worth. Claire's rejection had broken me, but it hadn't destroyed me. I was still standing, and I was ready to take something back. The wind was sharp that autumn afternoon as I clutched the flyer for the art fair, its edges crinkling in my hands. I stood by the community board, the world bustling around me. Mothers pushing strollers, teenagers laughing, a dog barking in the distance, and felt a tremor of something I hadn't felt in years possibility. My name is Eleanor, and I'm telling you this because I want you to know what it's like to stand at the edge of your own life, afraid to leap, but knowing you can't stay still any longer. The hurt of my daughter's betrayal still lingered, a shadow that followed me everywhere. But in that moment, I decided I wouldn't let it be the only thing that defined me. The weeks after my birthday had been a descent into a kind of solitude I hadn't known was possible. Claire's silence was a wound that refused to heal. I'd stopped calling her, stopped texting, stopped hoping she'd notice I was gone. I'd spent months waiting for a sign that I still mattered to her, a card, a call, even a fleeting "I miss you." But nothing came. The quilt I'd made her, the one she'd thrown away, haunted me. I'd see it in my dreams, its colors vivid against the gray of the trash bin, and I'd wake with a heaviness in my chest as if my heart were trying to carry it still. I was 65, and the world seemed to have decided I was no longer necessary, not to my daughter, not to my grandsons, not even to the life I'd built. My apartment, once a place of warmth, felt like a museum of my failures. The photos on the walls, Claire as a toddler, her graduation, her wedding were like ghosts watching me with eyes I couldn't meet. I'd stopped cleaning them, letting dust settle over the frames, as if I could soften the pain they held. I'd go to the library each day, shelving books with a mechanical precision, smiling at patrons who rarely smiled back. The library was my sanctuary. It's quiet, a balm for the noise in my head. But even there, I felt invisible. Younger staff chatted about their lives, their plans, while I was just the older woman in the cardigan, reliable but unremarkable. I wondered if this was what aging meant, not just the gray in your hair or the ache in your knees, but the slow fading of your presence, like a photograph left too long in the sun. But there were glimmers, small and fragile, that kept me from disappearing entirely. Lily, the young artist I'd met in the park, was one. After our second meeting at the library, we'd started crossing paths more often, sometimes by chance, sometimes because I'd linger near the pond, hoping to see her sketching. She had a way of making me feel real, not just a shadow of who I'd been. One afternoon, she showed me a drawing of the old oak by the water, its branches sprawling like veins. "It's like you," she said, her voice casual but kind, strong even after all these years. I laughed, embarrassed, but her words stayed with me, a quiet anchor in the storm of my thoughts. Then there was Margaret, my old friend, whose letter had pulled me from the edge. Our weekly coffee dates had become a lifeline, a reminder that I wasn't as alone as I felt. Margaret was 70 now, her hands trembling slightly from arthritis, but her spirit was fierce. She'd lost her husband 5 years ago, and her son lived across the country, rarely visiting. "We raised them to leave us," she said one day, her eyes soft but resolute. "But that doesn't mean we stop living." She'd started volunteering at a community garden, her hands in the dirt, coaxing life from the earth. Her strength inspired me, made me wonder if I could find a way to grow again, too. I'd begun sewing more, not for anyone else, but for myself. My sewing table, a sturdy oak piece Thomas had built when we were newlyweds, was my refuge. I'd sit there at night, the lamp casting a warm glow, and lose myself in the rhythm of needle and thread. I made a scarf, then a set of placemats, each stitch a small rebellion against the emptiness. The act of creating, of making something tangible, reminded me that I still had power, even if it was just over a piece of fabric. I'd look at my hands, spotted with age veins prominent, and see not weakness, but years of work, of love, of survival. The idea of the art fair terrified me, but it also thrilled me. I'd never shown my work publicly, never thought it was worth showing. My sewing had always been for others' dresses, for Claire curtains, for friends, quilts, for family. But Lily's suggestion to make something just for me and Margaret's insistence that I take something back had planted a seed. I spent days agonizing over the flyer, tucking it into my purse, then pulling it out to read again. The fair was in 2 months enough time to prepare, but the thought of standing at a booth, my creations on display, made my stomach churn. What if no one cared? What if they laughed? But then I'd think of the quilt discarded and forgotten, and I'd feel a spark of defiance. I wasn't ready to be thrown away too. I started small. I made a set of quilted coasters, then a tote bag with a delicate applique of flowers. Each piece was simple, but it was mine, born from my hands and my heart. I'd work late into the night, the silence of my apartment broken only by the soft hum of my sewing machine. Sometimes I'd talk to Thomas as if he were still there, sitting across from me. "Am I crazy for doing this?" I'd whisper, and I'd imagine his laugh, his hand on mine, telling me to keep going. Those moments alone, but not entirely, gave me courage. One evening I called Margaret and told her about the fair. "I'm thinking of signing up," I said, my voice trembling. There was a pause, and I braced for doubt, but then she laughed a bright, joyful sound. "Eleanor, that's wonderful. You're going to shine." She offered to help me prepare, and we spent the next weekend sorting fabrics, planning my booth. Her enthusiasm was contagious, and for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of excitement, like a child before a school play. Lily, too, became part of my quiet rebellion. I told her about the fair one day at the park, expecting her to brush it off, but her eyes lit up. "You have to let me see your work," she said, and a week later she came to my apartment. I was nervous, my hands sweaty as I laid out the coasters, the tote a small wall hanging I'd made. She studied each piece, her fingers tracing the stitches, and when she looked up, her smile was wide. "Eleanor, these are incredible. They're you." She insisted on helping me price them, her confidence bolstering mine. "People are going to love these," she said, and I wanted to believe her. As the fair approached, I felt a shift within me. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a steady hum of purpose. I was still hurting, still carrying the weight of Claire's rejection, but I was also moving forward. I'd stopped checking my phone for her calls, stopped hoping for an apology. Instead, I focused on the fair, on my sewing, on the people who saw me, Margaret, Lily, even the library patrons who'd started to notice my brighter smile. I was reclaiming something not just for the world, but for myself. The night before I submitted my application for the fair, I sat at my sewing table, a cup of tea gone cold beside me. I looked at the pieces I'd made, each one a step away from the woman who'd sat crying in her car by a trash bin. I thought of Claire, of the quilt of the years I'd spent trying to be enough for her, and I realized something: I didn't need her to see me to know I was worthy. I was Eleanor, and I was still here, still creating, still alive. The fair was just a beginning, a small act of courage, but it was mine, and that was enough to keep going. The morning of the art fair dawned crisp and golden, the kind of day that makes you believe in new beginnings, even when your heart is still stitched with old wounds. I stood at my booth, a small table draped with a cream-colored cloth, my creations laid out like offerings, coasters, tote bags, a wall hanging with embroidered vines. My hands trembled as I adjusted a price tag, but there was a fire in my chest, small but steady, that hadn't been there a year ago. My name is Eleanor, and I'm telling you this because I want you to know what it's like to stand in a place you never thought you'd reach, to feel the weight of your own worth after years of being told you had none. The pain of my daughter's betrayal was still there. A quiet ache, but I was learning to carry it differently, to let it fuel me instead of break me. The months leading up to the fair had been a slow, deliberate unraveling of the woman I'd become, the one who'd shrunk herself to fit into Claire's life, who'd let her daughter's rejection define her. After signing up for the fair, I'd thrown myself into my work with a focus I hadn't felt since my 20s, when I dreamed of owning a dress shop. I'd sew until my eyes burned, creating pieces that were no longer apologies or pleas for love, but expressions of who I was. A quilted purse with a pattern of sparrows, a table runner in shades of dusk. These were mine, born from my hands, my heart, my history. Each stitch was a declaration: I am still here. I am still enough. Margaret had been my anchor, her faith in me unwavering. She'd come over on weekends, her laughter filling my apartment as we sorted fabrics and debated prices. "You're not charging enough," she'd say, her eyes twinkling, and I'd blush, unused to valuing my own work. Lily, too, had become a constant presence. She'd stop by with coffee, her sketchbook tucked under her arm, and we'd talk for hours about art, about life, about the dreams we'd both tucked away. She was young enough to be my granddaughter, but there was a wisdom in her, a quiet strength that reminded me of my younger self, the one who'd believed she could do anything before life taught her to doubt. The fair itself was a revelation. I'd expected to feel out of place, a 65-year-old woman surrounded by younger artists. But the air was alive with color and chatter, and I found myself smiling, greeting strangers with a confidence I hadn't known I possessed. People stopped at my booth, their fingers tracing the stitches, their voices warm with questions. "Did you make this yourself?" a woman asked, holding up a tote bag. I knotted my throat tight, and she bought it, saying it reminded her of her mother's garden. Another bought a set of coasters for her sister, and a man purchased the wall hanging for his wife's birthday. Each sale felt like a small miracle, a validation not just of my work, but of me. Lily was there too, at her own booth across the aisle, her sketches pinned to a board. She'd wave at me between customers, her grin infectious, and at one point she ran over, throwing her arms around me. "You're a hit, Eleanor," she said, and I laughed, the sound surprising me. Margaret arrived later, her arms full of flowers she'd bought from another vendor. "For your triumph," she said, setting them on my table, and I felt tears prick my eyes, not from sadness, but from a joy I'd almost forgotten. By the end of the day, I'd sold nearly everything. I sat in my folding chair, my cash box heavier than I'd expected, and felt a swell of pride so fierce it almost hurt. I wasn't just a mother who'd been discarded, a widow who'd lost her place. I was Eleanor, a creator, a woman who'd taken a risk and found something beautiful on the other side. As I packed up, Lily helped me fold the tablecloth, her voice soft. "You did it," she said. "You showed them." I knew she didn't mean just the customers, and I nodded, unable to speak. That night, alone in my apartment, I sat with a cup of chamomile tea and let the day settle over me. The money from the fair was nice, but it was the feeling, the knowledge that I'd done something for myself that mattered most. I thought of Claire, of the quilt, of the years I'd spent trying to earn her love. I hadn't heard from her in nearly a year, not since my birthday, and the silence still stung, but it no longer consumed me. I was building something new, something that didn't depend on her approval. The fair was a turning point, but it was what came after that truly changed me. A few days later, I got a call from the fair organizer, a kind woman named Susan. "Your work was a standout," she said. "We're hosting a holiday market in December. Would you consider a larger booth?" I hesitated, the old doubts creeping in, but then I thought of the people at the fair, their smiles, their stories. "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "I'd love to." I threw myself into preparing for the holiday market, but I also started making other changes. I'd been living frugally, my savings, untouched, since Thomas died, but I decided to invest in myself. I bought a new sewing machine, one with features I'd only dreamed of, and I enrolled in an online design course, something I'd never have dared before. I started walking more, not just to the park, but through the town, noticing the way the light hit the old brick buildings, the way the river sparkled at dusk. I was seeing the world again, and it was seeing me back. One afternoon, as I sat with Margaret at her community garden, she handed me a trowel and pointed to a patch of earth. "Plant something," she said. I laughed, unsure, but I dug into the soil, dropping in a bulb she said would bloom into a tulip come spring. As I patted the dirt, I felt a connection to something larger, something enduring. I thought of my mother, her hands always busy with thread or soil, and I realized I was carrying her forward just as she'd carried her own mother. It was a quiet act, but it felt profound, like I was rooting myself in the world again. Lily, too, pushed me to grow. She invited me to an art class at the community center, and though I was nervous, I went. The room was filled with people of all ages, and for once I didn't feel like the odd one out. I painted a simple landscape, my brush, hesitant at first, but by the end I was lost in the colors, the freedom of it. The teacher, a woman in her 40s, praised my work, and I felt a flush of pride. I wasn't just sewing now. I was creating in new ways, exploring parts of myself I'd buried long ago. As winter approached, I made a decision that surprised even me. I'd been renting my apartment for years, a practical choice after selling my house for Claire's wedding. But I wanted something of my own again. I met with a realtor, a kind man who listened as I described what I wanted: a small house with a garden, a place where I could sow and grow and breathe. We found one, a cottage on the edge of town with a porch and a patch of land that begged for flowers. It was a risk dipping into my savings, but it felt right. I signed the papers, my heart pounding, and when I walked through the empty rooms, I saw not just a house, but a home. My home. The move was symbolic, a line drawn between the woman I'd been and the woman I was becoming. I packed my apartment, keeping only what mattered: my sewing table, Thomas's old chair, a few photos of happier times. The rest, including most of Claire's pictures, I stored in a box. I wasn't erasing her, but I was making space for myself. As I settled into the cottage, I hung my wall, hanging from the fair on the living room wall, its vines a reminder of my own growth. I was 65, and I was starting over, not with anger, but with a quiet, fierce determination to live for me. The first morning in my new cottage felt like a gift I hadn't earned. I woke to the sound of birds outside my window. their chatter weaving through the soft light filtering past the curtains. I'd sewn myself cream linen with a subtle pattern of ferns. I lay still for a moment, my hands resting on the quilt I'd made, not for anyone else, but for me. It was a patchwork of blues and greens colors that reminded me of the river where I used to take Claire as a child before the world grew complicated. My name is Eleanor, and I'm telling you this because I want you to know what it's like to rebuild yourself, piece by piece, after someone you love has torn you apart. The scar of my daughter's betrayal was still there, a quiet pulse beneath my skin, but I was learning to live with it, to let it remind me of my strength instead of my sorrow. The cottage was small, just a bedroom, a living area, a kitchen, and a sunroom that begged for a sewing table. But it was mine. The garden out back was overgrown, its roses tangled and wild, but I saw potential in the chaos, a chance to coax beauty from neglect. I'd spent the weeks after the art fair preparing for this move, packing my old life into boxes, choosing what to keep and what to release. The photos of Claire, her gap-toothed smile, her wedding day, went into a trunk, not out of anger, but because I needed space to breathe. I hung my own creations, instead the wall hanging from the fair, a new set of curtains, a throw pillow with embroidered sparrows. Each was a marker of the woman I was becoming, someone who didn't need permission to exist. The holiday market was approaching, and I was working harder than I had in years. The success of the art fair had lit something in me, a hunger to create, to be seen. I'd signed up for a larger booth, and I spent evenings in the sunroom, my new sewing machine, humming as I crafted quilts bags and table runners. I experimented with bolder designs, geometric patterns, vibrant threads, pushing myself beyond the safe choices I'd made for others. Lily had been right. These were for me, and that freedom made every stitch feel like a small victory. I'd work until midnight, a cup of tea cooling beside me, and when I stepped back to look at my creations, I felt a pride that was new and fierce. Margaret was a constant presence, her encouragement a steady hand on my shoulder. She'd visit with homemade scones, and we'd sit in the garden planning my booth or just talking about life. She'd started painting at the community center, her canvases full of bold colors, and her joy was contagious. "We're not done yet, Eleanor," she'd say, her eyes bright. Not by a long shot. Her words sank deep, rooting themselves in the part of me that had started to believe I could be more than a mother, more than a widow, more than the woman Claire had discarded. Lily, too, was a spark in my days. She'd come by after her shifts at the cafe where she worked her sketchbook always with her. We'd sit on the porch sharing stories, and I marveled at how easy it was to talk to her. She told me about her dreams of opening an art studio, her fears of failing, and I shared pieces of my own story. Not the quilt, not yet, but the shape of my loneliness, the way I'd felt invisible. "You're not invisible," she said one evening, her voice firm. "You're like a lighthouse, steady even when no one's looking." I laughed, embarrassed, but her words stayed with me, a light I carried into the darker moments. The holiday market was bigger than the art fair, with vendors from across the county and crowds that spilled into the streets. I was nervous, my stomach twisting as I set up my booth, but there was excitement too, a thrill I hadn't felt since I was young. My table was a riot of color quilts, draped over a rack bags and coasters arranged in neat rows, a small sign with my name in Margaret's elegant handwriting, "Eleanor's Creations." People stopped, their faces lighting up as they touched the fabrics, asked about my process, shared stories of their own mothers or grandmothers who'd sewn. I sold more than I'd hoped, but it was the conversations that stayed with me. The woman who bought a quilt for her daughter's new apartment. The man who chose a table runner for his wife's Christmas gift. The child who pointed at a bag and said, "It's like a garden." Lily's booth was nearby, her sketches pinned up like windows to her soul. She sold several pieces, and between customers we'd catch each other's eye sharing grins like co-conspirators. Margaret came too, her arms full of cookies she'd baked for the vendors, and she stayed for hours chatting with passers-by, pointing them to my table. "This is my friend Eleanor," she'd say, her voice proud. "She's a genius with a needle." I'd blush, but I didn't argue. For the first time, I felt like I deserved the praise. The market wasn't just a success, it was a turning point. I came home with a nearly empty table and a heart so full it ached. I sat in the sunroom, the cottage quiet around me, and let the day sink in. I'd done this not for Claire, not for anyone else, but for me. I thought of the quilt, of the trash bin, of the years I'd spent chasing my daughter's love. The pain was still there, but it was softer now, less a wound than a memory. I hadn't heard from Claire in over a year, and though I still loved her, still missed the girl she'd been, I was no longer waiting for her to save me. I was saving myself. That winter, I made another decision, one that felt both bold and inevitable. I'd been sitting on a piece of land Thomas and I had bought decades ago, a few acres on the outskirts of town. We dreamed of building a second home there, a place for retirement. But after he died, I'd let it sit untouched. Claire had always loved it. She'd talk about building her dream house there, a modern mansion with glass walls and a pool. I'd held on to it for her, thinking it would be her inheritance, a gift to show her how much I cared. But after the quilt, after the silence, I realized she didn't deserve it. Not yet, maybe not ever. I met with a lawyer, a quiet man with kind eyes, and we talked about my options. The land was valuable, worth more than I'd realized, and I could sell it or gift it. I didn't want the money for myself. I had enough from my savings and the markets, but I wanted the land to mean something. I thought of Lily, of her dream of an art studio, of the way she'd seen me when no one else had. I thought of the community center where I'd started painting, where people like Margaret and I were finding new ways to shine. And I started to form a plan, one I kept to myself, even from Margaret and Lily. It was a secret seed planted deep, waiting for the right moment to bloom. I began to live more fully in the world. I joined the community center's gardening club, my hands in the soil, alongside Margaret's planting bulbs and dreaming of spring. I took more classes, watercolor pottery, each one a step toward the girl I'd been the one who'd believed in her own potential. I walked through town with my head higher, noticing the way people smiled back, the way my presence mattered. I was 65, but I felt younger, not in body but in spirit, as if I'd shed a skin that no longer fit. One evening, as I sat on the porch with a quilt over my knees, I lit a candle, a habit I'd started after moving in. It was a small gesture, but it felt sacred, a way to honor the day, to honor myself. I thought of Thomas, of my mother, of the women who'd come before me, their strength woven into my bones. I thought of Claire, too, but not with anger. I wished her well, but I no longer needed her to complete me. I was Eleanor, and I was whole, not because of what I'd given, but because of what I'd chosen to keep. The winter air was sharp as I stepped onto the porch of my cottage, a mug of coffee warming my hands. The garden was dormant now, its roses pruned and tucked under burlap, but I could still see the promise of spring in the bare earth, the bulbs Margaret and I had planted, waiting patiently beneath the frost. I'd hung a wind chime by the door, its soft notes a gentle greeting each morning, and as I stood there watching the sunrise paint the sky in pinks and golds, I felt a quiet certainty settling into me. My name is Eleanor, and I'm telling you this because I want you to know what it's like to find your footing after the ground has been pulled from under you, to build a life not on what you've lost, but on what you choose to create. The pain of my daughter's rejection was still a part of me, like a scar that aches in the cold, but I was no longer defined by it. I was writing a new story, one stitch, one choice, one day at a time. The holiday market had been a triumph, not just in sales, but in the way it had anchored me to myself. I'd come home with a nearly empty booth and a heart so full it seemed to spill over, warming the corners of my cottage. The money was a bonus. I'd tucked it into a savings account, unsure what I'd do with it. But the real gift was the knowledge that I could stand in the world and be seen not as Claire's mother or Thomas's widow, but as Eleanor, a woman with something to offer. I'd framed a photo from the market one Lily had taken of me laughing behind my booth and hung it in the sunroom. It was a reminder this was who I was now and I wasn't going back. The months that followed were a season of growth, quiet but relentless. I'd thrown myself into preparing for the next market, a spring festival, and my sunroom was a whirlwind of fabric and thread. I was bolder now, experimenting with designs I'd never dared before: quilts with abstract patterns, bags with hand-painted accents, even a series of small tapestries inspired by the river that ran through town. I'd started incorporating elements from my painting classes, blending mediums in ways that felt like a conversation between my past and present. Each piece was a step further from the woman who'd sewn only for others who'd measured her worth by what she could give away. Margaret was my cheerleader, her visits a highlight of my week. She'd bring cuttings from her garden or a new recipe to try, and we'd sit in the kitchen, the smell of baking bread or simmering soup filling the air. She was painting more her canvases bolder, and we'd talk about our dreams not as distant fantasies, but as things we could still chase. "We're not too old," she said one afternoon, her hands dusted with flour. "We're just getting started." Her words were a spark igniting a part of me that had long been dormant. I'd spent so many years putting my desires, last Claire's needs, Thomas's dreams, the family's expectations, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to want something for myself. Now I was remembering. Lily was a constant too, her presence, a bridge between the generations. She'd started teaching an art class at the community center, and I'd signed up not because I thought I was any good, but because I loved the way she saw the world. Her classes were a mix of ages from teens to retirees, and I found myself laughing more my brush, moving with less hesitation. One day I painted a scene from my childhood, a field where my mother and I used to pick wildflowers, and when I showed it to Lily, her eyes softened. "This is beautiful, Eleanor," she said. "You should hang it in your house." I did, right above the fireplace, and every time I looked at it, I felt a surge of pride, not just for the painting, but for the courage it represented. My cottage was becoming a home in every sense. I'd started working on the garden, clearing weeds and planting beds for the spring. Margaret helped her knowledge of plants a gift, and we'd spend hours digging our hands in the soil, our laughter mingling with the chirp of sparrows. I planted lavender along the path to the porch, its scent a promise of warmer days, and I built a small trellis for climbing roses, a nod to my mother's love of them. The work was hard, my back aching by the end of the day, but it was a good ache, the kind that comes from building something lasting. I'd sit on the porch afterward, a quilt over my knees, and feel a connection to the earth, to my ancestors, to myself. The land Thomas and I had bought years ago was never far from my thoughts. It was a few acres of rolling green bordered by a creek and a stand of oaks, the kind of place that begged for a house filled with light. Claire had always loved it. She'd sketch plans for her dream home, a sleek, modern thing that didn't suit the land's quiet beauty. I'd held on to it for her, thinking it would be her legacy, a way to show her I'd always be there. But after the quilt, after the silence, I knew I couldn't give it to her. Not now, maybe not ever. My meetings with the lawyer had clarified its value more than I'd imagined enough to change someone's life. I'd started to see it not as Claire's inheritance, but as a tool, a way to do something meaningful. I wasn't ready to act yet, but the idea was growing a seed I tended in secret. I began to think more about legacy, not just in terms of money or land, but in the mark I wanted to leave. I'd spent so much of my life giving to Claire to my family that I'd rarely asked what I wanted my life to mean. Now I was asking. I started volunteering at the community center, helping with the gardening club and teaching a beginner's sewing class. The students were a mix, young mothers, retirees, even a few teenagers, and I loved watching their faces light up as they threaded a needle or finished their first seam. One woman, a single mother named Rosa, told me my class was the first time she'd felt proud of something in years. Her words hit me hard, reminding me of my own journey, and I realized I was giving again. But this time, it was different. I wasn't emptying myself. I was sharing from a place of fullness. My relationship with the town was changing too. I'd always been a quiet presence, the librarian, the widow. But now people knew me as the woman from the markets, the one who made beautiful things. Shopkeepers would wave as I passed, and at the cafe the barista started remembering my order, a lavender latte, a nod to my garden. I was no longer invisible, and that shift, small as it was, felt like a miracle. I was 65, but I felt alive in a way I hadn't in decades, as if I'd been given a second chance to be the woman I'd always meant to become. One evening, as I sat in the sunroom, a new quilt spread across my lap, I thought of Claire. I hadn't heard from her in nearly 2 years, and though I still loved her, still prayed for her, I no longer needed her to complete me. I'd stopped checking her social media, stopped waiting for a call that might never come. Instead, I focused on the life I was building: my cottage, my garden, my art, my friendships. I lit a candle as I did most nights, its flame a quiet ritual of gratitude. I thought of Thomas, of my mother, of the women who'd carried me here, their strength woven into every choice I made. I thought of Lily, of Margaret, of Rosa, of the people who saw me now not as a shadow but as a light. As I folded the quilt, my fingers brushing the stitches, I felt a resolve harden within me. The land, the legacy, the future, they were mine to shape. I didn't know exactly what I'd do, but I knew it would be for something greater than myself, something that honored the woman I'd become. I was Eleanor, and I was ready to claim my place not with anger or vengeance, but with a quiet, unshakable dignity that no one could take away. The spring festival was alive with color and sound, the town square buzzing with vendors' music and the laughter of children chasing balloons. My booth stood at the heart of it, larger than ever, draped in a quilt I'd made just for the occasion, a tapestry of greens and golds that caught the sunlight like a meadow in bloom. I stood behind it, my hands steady as I greeted customers, but inside my heart was racing. Today was more than a market. It was the day I'd chosen to reveal a decision that had been growing in me for months, a decision that would change everything. My name is Eleanor, and I'm telling you this because I want you to know what it's like to stand tall after years of being made small, to reclaim your power, not with shouts or vengeance, but with a quiet strength that speaks louder than words. The wound of my daughter's betrayal was still there, a faint echo in my chest, but I'd learned to carry it, to let it remind me of who I was and what I was capable of. The past year had been a journey of rediscovery, each step a stitch in the fabric of a new life. My cottage was my sanctuary, its garden budding with lavender and roses, its walls hung with my art. The markets had become my stage where I was no longer just the librarian or the widow, but Eleanor the creator, the woman whose work drew crowds. Margaret and Lily had been my pillars, their belief in me a light in the darker moments. My sewing classes at the community center had grown my students' pride in their work, mirroring my own. I was 66 now, and I felt more alive than I had in decades, as if I'd peeled away the layers of doubt and found the woman I'd always been meant to be. But beneath this growth, I'd been tending a secret. The land Thomas and I had bought, those acres of green by the creek, had weighed on my mind. Claire had always seen it as hers, her dream house already mapped out in her mind, a glass-walled monstrosity that clashed with the land's gentle beauty. I'd held on to it for her, thinking it would be my final gift, a way to prove my love even after she'd thrown my quilt in the trash. But her silence 2 years now without a call, a text, a single acknowledgement, had changed something in me. I couldn't give it to someone who saw me as disposable, who discarded not just my gift, but my heart. Instead, I'd found another purpose for it, one that felt like a legacy, not just for me, but for the community that had embraced me. I'd worked with my lawyer over the winter, drafting papers, making plans. The land was valuable, worth enough to fund something transformative. I'd thought of Lily, her dream of an art studio, and of the community center where people like me and Margaret had found second chances. I'd decided to donate the land to the town with a condition it would become a community arts and education center, a place for classes, gardens, and studios named after my mother Rose, who'd taught me to create with love. I'd kept it quiet, even from Margaret and Lily wanting the announcement to be a moment of truth, not just for me, but for those who'd underestimated me. The festival was the perfect setting. I'd arranged with the organizer, Susan, to make a brief speech during the afternoon program, a moment to share my gift with the town. But there was another reason my heart was pounding. I'd heard Claire was in town. Margaret had mentioned it casually, saying she'd seen Claire's car at the grocery store. I hadn't seen my daughter in 2 years, hadn't spoken to her since the birthday that broke me. I didn't know if she'd come to the festival, but the possibility hung over me, a storm cloud I couldn't ignore. I wasn't afraid, not exactly, but I felt the weight of what was coming, the collision of my past and my present. The morning passed in a blur of sales and smiles. My booth was a magnet. People drawn to the quilts and tapestries, their hands lingering on the stitches as they shared stories of their own. Lily was there, her booth across the way, her sketches selling as fast as she could pin them up. She'd run over during a lull, her eyes wide. "Eleanor, you're killing it," she said, and I laughed, the sound lighter than I felt. Margaret arrived with a thermos of tea, her presence a steadying force. "Something's up with you today," she said, her eyes narrowing. "You're glowing, but you're nervous." I smiled, brushing it off, but she knew me too well. As the afternoon approached, I felt a shift in the air. The crowd was thicker now, families spilling across the square, and I caught a glimpse of a familiar figure near the bandstand. Claire. She was with Greg, her husband, and their boys, Michael and Ben, who were taller now, their faces buried in their phones. My breath caught, but I didn't falter. She hadn't seen me yet, her attention on a food stall, but I knew she'd notice my booth eventually. My creations were too bold, too visible to be ignored. I straightened, smoothing my apron, and turned to a customer, my voice steady. I was ready. When Susan called me to the stage, the crowd hushed, their faces turned toward me. I stepped up, my hands clasped to keep them from trembling, and looked out at the sea of people, Margaret beaming, Lily watching with pride, and there near the back, Claire, her expression unreadable. I took a breath and began. "My name is Eleanor," I said, my voice clear. "Many of you know me from the library or these markets, but today I'm here to share something more. Years ago, my husband and I bought a piece of land by the creek, a place we dreamed of building a home. After he passed, I held onto it, thinking it would go to my daughter." I paused, my eyes finding Claire's. Her face tightened, a flicker of recognition, but I didn't waver. But life teaches us that love isn't about holding on. It's about giving where it's needed most. Today, I'm donating that land to our town to build the Rose Community Arts Center, a place for all of us to create, learn, and grow, named for my mother, who showed me the power of making something with your hands. The crowd erupted in applause, but I kept my eyes on Claire. She was frozen, her mouth slightly open, Greg whispering something to her. I didn't need to say more. The truth was there in the gift I'd given, in the life I'd built without her. I stepped down, my heart pounding, and returned to my booth, where Margaret hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. "You did it," she whispered, her voice thick. Lily was there too, her eyes shining. "That was incredible, Eleanor," she said. "You're incredible." Claire approached an hour later, her family trailing behind. The crowd had thinned, and I was packing up my hands, busy but my mind alert. "Mom," she said, her voice strained. "What was that about, the land? You gave it away." There was no apology, no softness, just a mix of shock and accusation. I looked at her, my daughter, the girl I'd raised, and felt a calm I hadn't expected. "Yes," I said simply. "It was mine to give, and I chose to give it where it would matter." Her eyes narrowed, and I saw the realization hit her, the dream house, the inheritance gone. Greg shifted uncomfortably, and the boys glanced up from their phones, sensing the tension. Claire opened her mouth, then closed it, her face a storm of emotions I couldn't read. I didn't yell, didn't accuse. I didn't need to. My dignity, my choice, said everything. She turned and walked away, her family following, and I let her go. The weight of her rejection was still there, but it was lighter now, overshadowed by the strength I'd found. The crowd's applause, Margaret's embrace, Lily's pride, they were my truth. Now not Claire's silence. I was Eleanor, and I'd reclaimed my power not by tearing anyone down, but by building something beautiful, something that would outlast me. The evening after the spring festival, I sat on my porch, a quilt draped over my knees, the air soft with the scent of lavender from my garden. The wind chimes sang its gentle song, and the sky was a deep indigo pricked with stars that felt close enough to touch. I lit a candle as I did most nights, its flame, steady in the stillness, a quiet ritual that grounded me. My name is Eleanor, and I'm telling you this because I want you to know what it's like to find peace after a storm, to stand whole in the life you've built, even when the ones you love most have turned away. The pain of my daughter's betrayal, the quilt thrown in the trash, was still a part of me, but it no longer held me captive. I'd woven it into my story, a thread among many, and I was stronger for it. The festival had been a turning point, not because of the applause or the donation of the land, but because of what it meant for me. I'd stood before the town, before Claire, and claimed my worth not with anger or revenge, but with a gift that would ripple outward, touching lives long after I was gone. The Rose Community Arts Center was already taking shape in plans and meetings with Lily and Margaret at the heart of it, their excitement a mirror of my own. I'd given the land to honor my mother, to honor the community that had seen me when I felt invisible, but most of all, to honor myself. It was a legacy, not of wealth, but of love, the kind that doesn't demand reciprocation. Claire's reaction at the festival lingered in my mind, her shock and silence, a final confirmation of the distance between us. I hadn't seen her since she walked away, her family trailing behind, and I didn't expect to hear from her soon. Part of me still ached for the girl she'd been, the one who'd clung to my hand by the river, who'd laughed as we baked cookies, who'd called me her best friend. But I knew now that love doesn't always mean holding on. Sometimes it means letting go, not out of bitterness, but out of respect for your own heart. I didn't hate Claire. I wished her well, prayed for her happiness, but I no longer needed her to complete me. I was whole on my own. My cottage was my haven, its walls alive with the things I'd made: quilts, paintings, a pottery vase from a class I'd taken on a whim. The garden was thriving, its roses climbing the trellis, its lavender buzzing with bees. I'd started hosting small gatherings there. Margaret and her gardening friends, Lily and her art students, Rosa and the women from my sewing class. We'd sit on the porch sharing stories and laughter, the candlelight casting a warm glow. These were my people now, not because they replaced my family, but because they chose to see me, to share in the life I was building. I'd learned that family isn't just blood. It's the ones who show up, who hold you when you're breaking, who celebrate when you rise. Lily had become like a daughter to me, though I'd never say it aloud for fear of burdening her. She'd been offered a teaching role at the new arts center, and her dream of a studio was closer than ever. One afternoon, she brought me a sketch she'd made of my garden, the roses and lavender rendered in soft pencils. For you, she said, her smile shy. I hung it in the sunroom next to my painting of the wildflower field, and every time I looked at it, I felt a surge of gratitude. She'd seen me not as an old woman to be pitied, but as a creator, a friend, a lighthouse, as she'd once called me. Margaret, too, was a gift. She'd started a scholarship fund for the Arts Center, using money she'd saved from her late husband's estate, and we'd spent evenings planning its future, dreaming of classes and gardens and community nights. Her laughter was a constant in my life, her strength a reminder that we were never too old to grow. "We're rewriting the rules, Eleanor," she'd say, her eyes twinkling, and I'd nod, because that's exactly what we were doing. My sewing classes had grown, and I'd started mentoring Rosa, the single mother who'd found pride in her first stitches. She'd made a quilt for her daughter, a bright, joyful thing, and when she showed it to me, her eyes shining, I felt a pride that rivaled anything I'd felt for Claire. I was giving again, but this time it was different. I wasn't emptying myself. I was sharing from a place of abundance. The community center had become my second home, its rooms filled with the hum of creation, and I knew I'd found my purpose not in being needed, but in being present. I thought often of the land of what it would become. The plans included a garden in my mother's name, a place for roses and wildflowers, and I imagined walking there one day, my hands in the soil, feeling her spirit beside me. I thought of Thomas, too, and how proud he'd be, not just of the center, but of me. I wore his old watch now, its leather strap soft against my wrist, a reminder of the life we'd built and the strength he'd always seen in me. I didn't need to prove myself to him or to anyone, but wearing it felt like carrying him forward, a quiet act of love. One evening, as summer approached, I walked to the creek near my cottage, a place I hadn't visited in years. It was the same creek that bordered the land I'd given away its water clear and steady, reflecting the fading light. I carried a small box, one I'd kept in my closet since the move. Inside was a locket my mother had given me when I was 16, a simple silver thing with a rose etched on its face. I'd planned to pass it to Claire one day, but that dream had faded with the quilt. Instead, I knelt by the water and opened the locket, letting a single pressed petal fall into the current. It was a gesture small but sacred, a way to release the past and honor the present. I watched the petal drift, carried by the creek toward the land that would soon bloom with new life, and I felt a peace so deep it brought tears to my eyes. I stood the locket still in my hand and looked at the sky now streaked with gold. I was 66, and I was at home in my skin, in my life, in the world I'd created. I didn't need Claire's approval or anyone's to know my worth. I'd found it in the stitches of my quilts, the colors of my paintings, the laughter of my friends, the soil of my garden. I'd found it in the choice to give not out of obligation, but out of love for myself and the community that held me. As I walked back to the cottage, the stars bright above me, I thought of you, the one listening to my story. I want you to know that your worth isn't measured by who accepts you, but by how you choose to honor yourself. You are enough not because of what you give or what you've lost, but because you are here, still breathing, still capable of creating something beautiful. I lit my candle that night, its flame a beacon in the dark, and I smiled knowing I was home, not just in my cottage, but in my heart. And that was enough.